We are joined today by Rabbi Brant Rosen of Tzedek Chicago, which made headlines in the last couple of weeks for being the first U.S. synagogue to include anti-Zionism as one of its core principles.
There are more Jews who are publicly defining themselves as anti-Zionist. Along with that, there's been a strong effort by the government of Israel and advocacy organizations to tar anti-Zionism as antisemitism. There's an understanding that there is a rise, particularly in the Jewish community, of Jews who are out of principle and out of conscience defining themselves in opposition to Zionism, rooted in a fundamental injustice, particularly in a land that has always been multi-ethnic and multi-religious.
Yeah. Jews were anti-Zionist before they were Zionist because it was Christians who were preaching Zionism for the longest time.
That is true.
And Jews were like, how about we don't get raptured, actually?
What does it mean to be a Jew?
What is the confusing part about do not kill and do not steal?
Palestine Pod. Hello and welcome to episode 51 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram. And you can call me Mikey Intifada if you think being an anti-Zionist Jew is bad, but burning olive trees is a good Jew.
Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. And if you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram @ThePalestinePod. Find us also on Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes, an additional 1 to 2 podcasts per week, including our latest podcast, the Patreon Pod. It's a little more laid back. We talk politics, Palestine, pop culture, and get a little more personal between Michael and myself. We're also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with our Patreon subscribers only. So really exciting stuff. Check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. So Rabbi Rosen, I don't know how much you have checked our podcast out, but basically, the premise is Michael is a comedian. I'm a lawyer, and
wait, I am.
We're heavy on the anti-Zionist theme throughout our entire show. Obviously, Michael's Jewish and I'm Palestinian, but we are, we're not a normalizer podcast. We are heavy anti-Zionist. So it's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you because you value that as well. So
thanks. Yes, I've checked out a few of your episodes since we connected, and
okay, great.
It's on my list now.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought your episode about Tantur was really powerful and really. So
thank you so
much.
I
appreciate what you do.
Love it. We appreciate you. It's gonna be a great interview. Let's get this popping.
We are joined today by Rabbi Brant Rosen of Tzedek Chicago, which made headlines in the last couple of weeks for being the first U.S. synagogue to include anti-Zionism as one of its core principles. We can't wait to talk to you about this, Rabbi. But for our listeners who don't know you, I'm going to provide just a quick introduction. Rabbi Brant was ordained by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 1992 and served congregations in Los Angeles and Denver before coming to Chicago in 1998 to serve as the rabbi of Jewish Reconstructionist congregation. Rabbi Brant became an increasingly vocal activist for justice and human rights, particularly with respect to Israel-Palestine. And after publicly wrestling with his relationship to Israel and openly questioning his lifelong Zionism, he eventually became a prominent Jewish presence in the Palestine Solidarity movement. He co-founded the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council and Ta'anit Tzedek Jewish Fast for Gaza. Rabbi Brant is also author of Wrestling in the Daylight, A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity, and his essays have appeared in a number of anthologies like Zionism in the Quest for Peace in the Holy Land, On Anti-Semitism, Solidarity and the Struggle for Justice, and Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, Stories of Personal Transformation. Rabbi Brant, welcome to the Palestine Pod.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you.
So Tzedek Chicago was founded 7 years ago, in part to create a Jewish community that is free from strong attachment to Israel. The congregation originally characterized itself as non-Zionist, but last week became anti-Zionist. So why anti-Zionism as opposed to non-Zionism, and why now?
That's a great question to start with. When we started in 2015, as you said, we were very consciously trying to create a Jewish congregation, a Jewish spiritual community for Jews and folks in general who wanted to affiliate in a Jewish community but did not define themselves as Zionists. So at the time, we used the word non-Zionism. And I can't really tell you if we had long conversations about that specific term, but since that time, I think we've been having internal conversations about the difference between non-Zionism and anti-Zionism. And I think largely when you say why now, I think it's because the profile of Jewish non-Zionists has risen. I think there are more Jews who are publicly defining themselves as anti-Zionist. And I think it's not a coincidence that along with that, there's been a strong effort by the mainstream Jewish community and the government of Israel and Israel advocacy organizations to tar anti-Zionism as antisemitism. We are hearing more and more rhetoric along those terms. And I think it's largely a backlash. I think there's an understanding that there is a rise, particularly in the Jewish community, of Jews who are out of principle and out of conscience, defining themselves in opposition to Zionism. And I think when we talk about what is the difference between the two, I would say that non-Zionist, it's a neutral term. It just simply means you are not Zionist, but it doesn't say anything more about what that really means. Whereas anti-Zionist really is an ideological statement, right? It's aligning oneself with a point of view that understands that Zionism is a ideology and a movement that is rooted in a fundamental injustice. It is rooted in the creation and maintenance of an exclusively Jewish ethno-state that is predicated on the identity of one particular group of people, and as such, is structurally inequitable, is structurally unjust, particularly in a land that has always been multi-ethnic and multi-religious. We didn't have any real formal talks about this among our leadership until relatively recently, but I was having a conversation with our president, our congregation president, Scout Bratt, and we were talking, and I mentioned to them, do you think maybe it's time to start talking about sharpening our core values to include anti-Zionism? And they said, I've been thinking the same thing. And so this really began as just a personal conversation. So we brought it to the board, our next board meeting, and this was late last year in December, I think. We had a great conversation. It was not your usual, discussion on a board meeting, a board agenda. It was powerful, and in the end, the board decided unanimously, actually, to change the word. It's really a half a word from non to anti in our core values statement, which was quite an extensive statement. This was one part of a much larger statement that's not only about Zionism.
I got to say, the most surprising thing about that is you got a room full of Jews to agree.
It was surprising. We are an ideologically oriented congregation. So, I think maybe we don't have as much disagreement as you might think, but we're Jews, right? Absolutely. Right. Debate is in our DNA. So I was surprised. I did not expect it to be unanimous, but the board decided they didn't want to just hand that down and up from on high and change unilaterally the core values without having a larger congregational conversation about it. So the board decided to create a community process by which our members engaged in conversation with one another about the issue. And it took a few months. It started in late December, and we had a series of membership meetings that were facilitated, and it was an amazing process. It was, I think we had a lot of discussion about not just Zionism, but the anti-racist movement in general. And, there was a famous quote by Angela Davis that I think was very impactful in our conversation, which is, in a racist world, it's not enough to be unracist. You have to be anti-racist. In other words, it's all well and good to say you're not racist, but when you say you're an anti-racist, you're taking a stand. You're talking about something structural that needs to be dismantled and transformed. We were able to really carve out space to talk about a very, very charged and difficult issue in the end in what I thought was a very thoughtful manner, which is unusual for this particular issue, as you know. It's very difficult to talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism in a way that's not polarized and full of unhelpful rhetoric, to put it mildly. And then we held an online vote from our membership, and in the end, over half of our households cast votes, and it was about 72% in favor of making the change. So that's what we did and made it official just about 2 weeks ago.
I am so proud of the congregation, and I was failing when I heard about it, honestly. I'm so excited to talk to you about it because, what is non-Zionism? As you say, it's a wishy-washy word, right? If anybody said that they were a non-racist, I'd be like, that guy's racist, right? Like, at least in private. Super happy to hear about this development.
Thank you.
And
thanks, Michael.
I think that, you serve as like a global hub of anti-Zionism, like for Jews, right? Because I'm not from Chicago, but I still feel a kinship to your congregation as a result of this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's important to note that Jewish anti-Zionism has been around since Zionism. This is nothing
before
new.
Zionism, right?
Yeah.
Jews were anti-Zionist before they were Zionist because it was Christians who were preaching Zionism for the longest time.
That is true.
And Jews were like, how about we don't get raptured, actually? That was the mainstream position in Judaism for a good long time.
It's very true. Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism, which many people don't know. And before the concept of modern Zionism, modern nationalism, I should say, political nationalism, in general, Jewish spiritual tradition was opposed to the notion of creating a sovereign Jewish state in the land. It was very clear about that's something that could only happen in Messianic times. But in the meantime, the diaspora is the focal point of Jewish life. Judaism was born in the diaspora. And to many of us, what is so beautiful about Judaism is that it's a spiritual system that can find God wherever we live. We see the world as our homeland, and Jews have been able to create amazing community in very, very different parts of the world through very different periods of history. And that's one of the secrets of our survival and our success, I would argue. So I think in addition to being anti-Zionist, I think we're trying to lift up a positive vision of diasporic life, which has always been just central to Jews and Judaism from the beginning.
So I'm reading Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro's book now, The Empty Wagon, all 1,200 pages of it. It's a big book.
That's actually the anti-Zionist Torah, if you've ever...
Yeah. So in it, he speaks about why Zionism is inconsistent with Jewish belief and about the need to remain in exile. So is this something that factored at all in your decision to oppose Zionism, or was the decision really more rooted in the human rights issues that are at stake?
I think it's hard to separate the two. I would say I don't see them as a binary. I think when you affirm a diasporic consciousness, and I would there are other peoples who live in a diaspora. By the way, it's not unique to Jews. Palestinians, for instance, have a diaspora. African Americans understand the world in diasporic ways as well. And I think when you have a diasporic consciousness, that automatically puts you in a sense of connection and empathy with all peoples who are marginalized and all peoples who live on the periphery and are otherized. And so human rights and diaspora, I think, are two sides of the same coin. And, exile is a word that for many people, I think, is a pejorative term. The Hebrew word is galut, and it's often translated as exile. But, I think it's also at its core a very existential statement that we're all in a sense living in a kind of an exile. It's just part of the human experience. So, I think this is just a way of trying to unpack what this means, but also to attach an important power analysis to it, to understand that historically throughout the world, there have been those in power and those who have been oppressed by state power. And when you live with diaspora consciousness, that gives you a sense of solidarity with all peoples who are marginalized, I would argue. I hope all that makes sense.
That's so powerful. I literally have chills. I know you can't see it, but I promise you it's there. One of the other things that Rabbi Shapiro talks about is how Zionism has rewritten the definition of what is a Jewish person and has made it such that if you support Zionism and thus the creation of a sovereign state in the land of Palestine for Jewish people only, then you are, quote unquote, a good Jew. And if you don't support that, well, then you're a bad Jew, and has sort of deleted the actual definition of a Jew, which is somebody who lives in accordance with the Torah and the rules and regulations that are spelled out in the holy books, right? So is this, can you speak a little bit more on this notion? What does it mean to be a Jew? There's so much of discussion when you're speaking about Zionism and anti-Zionism about something as simple as what does it mean to be a Jew? I think it would be really helpful if we just clarified, what that is.
Yeah, what is the confusing part about do not kill and do not steal?
Yeah, that's the standing on one foot definition, right?
Could you clarify for us? Because it seems that they're having a bit of an issue, right?
Just be a decent person, for God's sake. That's
right.
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer that question. The first thing I wanted to say, though, is you're absolutely right that Zionism has become normalized in the Jewish community, which is just it's bizarre.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying. Zionism began when it emerged in the 19th century, Jewish political Zionism in the 19th century. It was a radical movement. It was a radical movement of Jewish modernity. And
I'd say it's still pretty radical. They didn't slow it down. They didn't pump the brakes. You know what I mean?
We're in agreement. But as Lara was saying, it's become normalized. It's considered now radical to be anti-Zionist. Just in a few years, really. I mean, we're not talking about a long period of time. It's completely subverted what it means to be Jewish.
Yes.
And I have to say also, since we made this announcement on Twitter, sort of had a mini explosion about this. I don't know if you followed some of the toxicity.
I'm kicked off Twitter. I saw you set Twitter on fire.
It was really quite something. But I would sort of categorize all of the nasty, toxic crap in different buckets, but most of it was the most predominant argument was you're not Jewish. This is not Torah. Just read the Torah, you asshole.
Yes.
And what's fascinating to me is that it's just how thoroughly this notion that somehow Zionism and Judaism are the same thing, and Zionism is somehow embedded in the Torah, that it's just simply not true. Zionism is a political national movement that arose in the 19th century that opposed traditional Judaism, that was seeking to overturn what it had meant to be Jewish for centuries. And in just a few generations, really, it has now sort of it's seized the mantle of normative Judaism. And I think if we could at least pull on that thread a little bit to begin the unraveling of that falsity, then I think we'll have succeeded to some extent. So that's my first answer, Lara, to your question. The second is that what does it mean to be a Jew? I mean, we could have several episodes on that one. To go back to what I was saying before, Judaism as we know it began after the destruction of the temple, when the Jewish diaspora in the year 73 ACE, and the Jewish diaspora as we know it began. And it really began as a spiritual response to the reality of living in exile. And what it found was that not only you could, but you could thrive that way. I think if the temple had not been destroyed, I would argue that there would be no Jews today, that Judaism would have been an interesting sort of cultic system that was a footnote in history books. But it became a world religion, a literal worldwide religion, after the temple was destroyed, and we learned how to live anywhere in the world with this spiritual system that wasn't dependent on a temple in Jerusalem, wasn't focused on animal sacrifice, but rather on prayer and acts of justice and loving kindness. And there's a very famous rabbinic saying known as a midrash. It says that when the children of Israel went into exile, God went into exile with them, which to me, even if you're not a religious person or theologically inclined, is such a powerful statement. This notion of God in exile, that we find the divine experience, proximity to the divine wherever we happen to live. It's not out there. It's not in some lofty place or in some lofty kingdom, but it's everywhere we live. And to me, that's what it means to be Jewish, is to affirm goodness and divinity anywhere that we live in the world, and create communities and seek to repair the world anywhere in the world that we happen to live. And that's what it means to be Jewish.
Yeah, I think what you and your congregation have done is something that the Zionist Project really fears, right? Which is the open and clear detangling of the fact that Zionism not only has no place in Judaism, but they're actually diametrically opposed, right? Like, it's something that I've committed my life to as well. And your congregation stance is the first of many to come, I'm sure. It says loudly and proudly, I'm Jewish and I support Palestinian human rights. I'm Jewish and my Judaism has nothing to do with murder or demolition or ethnic cleansing. That Judaism actually comes from a place of justice. And the Zionist policies that we can build walls, buy bigger guns and rockets, and subjugate a people into safety for all Jews is not a sustainable campaign. And it's definitely one that really has nothing to do with Judaism. Right? Your congregation means that anti-Zionist Jews can step out of their muzzled closets that we've been in for years, where we were scared to, quote unquote, make waves or face reprisals from congregations because we don't support apartheid. Right? The people who support apartheid are the ones who should be made to feel ostracized. The instinct to uphold and defend apartheid should be a marginal position, a position people should have flocked away from. We should be able to hold our heads up high in any room full of Jews. And now, thanks to your congregation, we also have a physical place to worship and to feel a sense of community. And I just really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. I think it's also important to point out, as I said before, that Jewish anti-Zionism has been around for a long time. And, while we may be the first progressive American synagogue to declare itself as anti-Zionist, there's Jewish Voice for Peace has declared itself anti-Zionist. There's IJAN, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, that's been around for quite a long time. So there are Jewish political movements today that have become an institutional home for anti-Zionists. But I think it's really important for those of us in the religious community to be able to affirm exactly what you're saying, that this is not just a political statement, but it's a spiritual statement as well. But that it's an issue of human rights, Lara, as you were saying, but it's also an issue of spiritual conscience. And I think we're hoping that this will at least begin a conversation in the religious Jewish world to understand this as a important Jewish spiritual value as well.
Is it more than just a value? Is it not a spiritual obligation to remain in exile? One of the things, that Zionists will say, I can't count how many times I've heard this. God gave us the land.
Often secular Zionists will say that too, which is
exactly.
Interesting.
They don't believe in God, but they believe that he gave them the land anyway. Right?
They busy eating a bacon sandwich talking about God gave us the land.
But from a theological perspective, are they not missing the rest of the story, which is that, yes, God may have given land to the tribes of Israel, but he also took it back.
Right. I would see even before
no
that
take-backs.
That it was not this was not a unconditional gift. This was a very conditional. This was a lease with very, very specific conditions attached to it. And the Torah makes this very clear, actually, that if you don't follow my ways, that it literally says the land will vomit you out, is the precise term. And particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, which is right before the entrance into the land, this is repeated over and over and over again. And if you read on in the Hebrew Bible, that's exactly what happens, that the Israelites backslide and exile ensues. And there's a a very strong sense that the land does not belong to anyone. And actually, in the book of Leviticus, it says that you shall not sell the land beyond reclaim, because the land is not yours, it's mine. God says that the land belongs to me, and you are strangers on it. You are gerim on the land. So that's, when Zionists say God gave us the land as if it was just some kind of exclusive, unconditional gift, that's just not what it actually, not only is that incredibly problematic from human rights point of view, it's not even part of our sacred text. And then, there are so many secular Israelis who will say, I don't believe in God, but God gave us the land. I mean, David Ben-Gurion was very famous for holding up a Bible and saying, this is our deed to the land of Israel. This, secular Eastern European Jewish man who was using the Bible as some kind of sense of political entitlement, which is just problematic on so many levels.
Are you sure Danny Danon did that at the UN?
Yes, he did. Yeah. It's a very common, it's a very common trope, and it's very compelling. I mean, this land is mine. God gave this land to me. It's very powerful, but it's also deeply problematic and wrong.
Yeah, the book did say don't sell the land, but what about unscrupulously buying it and taking it by force?
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because then people will also say, well, yes, everything you're saying is true, but it also says that in the Torah that you have to go into the land and conquer it and ethnically cleanse the Canaanites from it and occupy it yourself. So what about that? And to that I would say, yes, those are incredibly problematic parts of our sacred tradition. And beyond the Torah, there is a great deal of discussion in rabbinic text, post-biblical Jewish sacred texts like the Talmud and the Mishnah, Jewish law, that discusses this very issue and talks about what these texts actually mean and what they don't mean, and the fact that they were rooted in an ancient mindset referring to nations that don't exist anymore. Right. The 7 Canaanite nations, we don't even know fully if they actually ever existed the way they're written about in the Bible in the first place. But many traditional rabbis of the Talmudic period said that these laws are null and void because they refer to an ancient time that that doesn't apply to the time in which we live. So, I would say that the biblical conquest tradition needs to be taken very, very seriously. And by the way, it's at the root of Western colonialism. Christians, the Christian Europe has had a field day with the biblical conquest tradition. Right. The United States was, the settler colonial conquest of the United States in many ways was justified through the Bible, through those particular passages in the Bible. And it needs to be grappled with and taken very seriously. I'm not a fan of sweeping it under the rug or saying, that's the part we don't like and we don't read. I think we need to read it, and we need to come to terms with it and acknowledge that, we don't root our values in literal interpretations of anything in the Torah or in the Bible or any religious text for that matter.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Talmud does pretty clearly say don't pick up arms and seize Palestine, right?
Right. No, as I said, the rabbis were fiercely opposed to the notion of creating a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine, creating a so-called third Jewish Commonwealth. That could only happen when the Messiah came. And there are anti-Zionist Jews today, that are ultra-Orthodox, the Satmar sect and other Neturei Karta sects. There are other anti-Zionist Jews who aren't necessarily driven by political notions of human rights, but by the notion of not forcing God's hand and before the Messiah comes. And I should say that that's not the kind of anti-Zionism that we're promoting. That's a different part of the Jewish world, and I appreciate it and understand it in many ways, but there's also lots of values that are held by those communities that I don't adhere to and find problematic personally. So I guess in a way, it's not completely true to say we're the first anti-Zionist congregation in the country, because there are many Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in the states and around the world, including in Israel, by the way, that are anti-Zionist. But I would say we're the first progressive
How do they do
Jews.
that?
How's that possible? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
That seems
yeah.
like some mental gymnastics.
Yeah, no, there are anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. You know,
No,
the Neturei,
I know they exist. I'm just joking.
yeah. In the Neturei Karta, if you go to certain parts of Jerusalem, there you'll find these communities are actually thriving.
They call it Palestine, right?
They call
are
it Palestine.
constantly.
They don't serve in the army. They
Right.
don't, but the government needs them because they are a fast-growing population in the country. So demographically, they're very important to the state of Israel, even if they are ideologically not aligned.
I don't know. It seems like they're like using water hoses on them every time I check in.
Yeah, they are a vociferous bunch.
I read also that for a long time, European Orthodox Jews rejected Zionism and considered it a false messiah.
Mm-hmm.
And, what was it that Theodor Herzl tried before coming up with Zionism, that all the Jews should convert to Christianity? Wasn't that his idea?
Yes. Well, he was an assimilated Viennese Jew. He was not someone who really identified as part of the Jewish community before he began to build the Zionist movement. And he really was motivated by what he saw going around him in Western Europe as the rise of anti-Semitism. And he saw this, he called this the Jewish problem, that we need to deal with it somehow. There are different ways to do that. And one of them was to assimilate, that would do away with this problem. And we could just become just like them. He also advocated for a period of time picking a different place other than Palestine, Uganda, and there were other options that I think were bandied about for a while, very briefly. So he was not motivated from a deep sense of Jewish identity. He himself came around relatively late to identifying as a Jewish person. And I think in many ways, his identity as a Viennese European person was much more motivating to his life than being a Jew, because he was never really part of the community.
So in doing research for this episode, I was looking at news articles written about you. And in 2016, the Times of Israel wrote an article about your synagogue entitled, quote, "Why Millennials Flock to Chicago's Non-Zionist Synagogue." Now, the congregation now more strongly identifies as anti-Zionist. And suddenly, the Times of Israel published an article saying, quote, "Preaching to the margins. Chicago synagogue adopts anti-Zionism as a core value." They actually used the same picture, by the way, which has a backdrop of Black Lives Matter activists. I think it's funny that they used the same picture for like clearly different messages. But it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, how can you have people flocking to the margin, right? If people are flocking, it's the mainstream. And that seems like it's an attempt by the Israeli media to sort of undercut what they see as a growing threat, right? So what do you think of the recent media coverage surrounding your congregation's decision?
Yes, yeah, I remember that first article you referred to, and I remember being really annoyed by that headline, "Millennials Flock," because we have a very diverse demographic in our congregation, and it's not just sort of we have a strong core of young people, but that was just such a reductionist point of view. They were written by two different people. I mean, I think with two different points of view and probably two different agendas in writing those articles, even if they were for the same periodical. I'm of a few minds about the press coverage. We want press coverage. Obviously, we don't want to do this and just not have people know about it. We want it to be known. But whenever you have press coverage, you're going out on a bit of a limb, because you're really dependent, as much as you try to control the message and be clear about what it is that you're doing. You're always giving it up to this writer and this editor to write what they're going to write. And for the most part, I think it's been okay. There was one recent article that wrote about what we did, and then interviewed about 4 or 5 people in opposition to what we did to create that impression that we're somehow on the margins. When there are a lot of people in the Jewish world that you could interview who would be supportive of anti-Zionism and what Tzedek Chicago has done. So that creating that impression that we're this weird marginalized, small, relatively unimportant community, I think, is really problematic. They wouldn't be writing about us if we were that marginal. So that I find that problematic. On the other hand, look, we are a minority in the Jewish world. I'm not going to deny that. Part of the point of standing up and voicing your point of view and your conscience in the world means you're going to attract heat, and you're going to find people who latch on to the fact that you are a minority and try to marginalize you as unimportant. And so, I'm of two minds about that. I also, I expected there to be lots of horribleness on social media, which there was, and that also kind of goes with the territory. Twitter can be a useful tool, I think, in movement building. It's also at the same time its own little toxic universe.
Oh yeah.
That you need to, and particularly when it comes to Israel and Zionism, the troll army, the Zionist, this as well, if not better than me, the Zionist troll army is very, very finely tuned and waiting to pounce. And many of these are bots. They're not even human beings. If you look at some of these accounts, there's like 2 or 3 followers. The State of Israel and Israel advocacy organizations are paying, hundreds, if not thousands of people to just troll the internet and respond like this in really, really horrible, hateful ways. And so that's something you have to sort of accept as part of the deal as well.
Yeah, you told me that they came at you like talking about the scripture, and actually that's pretty nice. Usually they just call me a capo, make a day of it,
Yeah, no, I get that too, believe me. Yeah. There are certain memes and tropes that they love to fall back on, and capo and self-hating and all of that is.
This leads us to what I wanted to discuss, which was really the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. Zionists will often frame anti-Zionists as being anti-Semitic, and they refuse to reckon with the anti-Semitism that is the foundation, essentially, of Zionism itself. So can you talk about the connection between Zionism and anti-Semitism? Are Zionists anti-Semites all the time? Sometimes?
I think when we're talking broadly, it's really important historically to understand that, I mentioned that Herzl was responding to the anti-Semitism of his time. And I think in many ways, the Zionist movement and Zionist ideology, classic Zionist ideology, has a kind of symbiotic relationship with anti-Semitism. It needs anti-Semitism for its own raison d'etre, for its own reason to exist. It needs anti-Semitism. Otherwise, there's no point. And so as a result, from the very beginning, Zionists have curried favor with anti-Semites for support. I mean, whether it was, Herzl trying to find diplomatic support for Zionism from anti-Semitic politicians in Russia. The Balfour Declaration is probably the classic example of this. Lord Balfour was the foreign minister of Great Britain in 1917, issued the Balfour Declaration that promised the Jewish people a Jewish home in Palestine. Balfour was a notorious anti-Semite. He was one of the big supporters of the anti-alien bill that was trying to keep Jews who were escaping from pogroms in Eastern Europe out of Great Britain. The only reason he was supporting a Jewish home, quote unquote, in Palestine for Jews is to get them out of England. And that the Zionists have always curried favor with anti-Semites because they understood that it was in their best interest to get Jews out of their midst and put them somewhere else. Balfour was also a Christian Zionist, so he had, religious motives for issuing that declaration as well. You can see it today in the state of Israel's own diplomatic approach. That their embrace of people like Orban in Hungary. They have been very happy to embrace some of the most odious right-wing white supremacists and anti-Semites in the world, because that's a way for them to gain their own political traction. So, I think it's really important that even though Zionists like to tag anti-Zionists like us as anti-Semites, they are the ones who really are currying favor with the ones for whom Jewish safety is not at the top of their list. And as I think we're saying, Lara, it's problematic because there is real anti-Semitism in the world, and it takes attention away when the state of Israel is constantly tarring Palestinians as anti-Semites and Arabs in general or Muslims or those who stand in solidarity with Palestinians as anti-Semites. And you have white supremacists going into synagogues in the United States, and gunning Jews down during Shabbat. It takes attention away from the very real threat of the rise of violent anti-Semitism in this country and around the world. And that's something that I think we need to shine a light on in no uncertain terms. Take away somehow this claim that is anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist, when really the truth is quite the opposite.
Yeah, and Zionists like to pretend that there's nobody in the world who's ever gone from being a Zionist to being an anti-Zionist. And that's just not true, right? Not even in the scope of my lifetime, and certainly not in the time that people have been colonizing Palestine. Celebrated historian Hans Kohn, active in the Zionist movement from 1909 onwards, wrote the following letter. He said, quote, "I feel that I can no longer remain a leading official with the Zionist organization. We pretend to be innocent victims. Of course, the Arabs attacked us in August 1929. Since they have no armies, they could not obey the rules of war. They perpetrated all the barbaric acts that are characteristic of a colonial revolt. But we are obliged to look into the deeper cause of this revolt. We have been in Palestine for 12 years since the start of the British occupation, without having even once made a serious attempt at seeking through negotiations the consent of the indigenous people. We have been relying exclusively upon Great Britain's military might. We have set ourselves goals which by their very nature had to lead to conflict with Arabs. For 12 years, we pretended that the Arabs did not exist and were glad when we were not reminded of their existence." End quote. Jewish National and University Library, Kohn to Bertold Feiwel, Jerusalem, November 1929.
Hans Kohn. Yes, I'm a big Hans Kohn fan. And there are many like him, Judah Magnus, Hannah Arendt, Martin Buber, even Zionists like Ahad Ha'am, who was a cultural Zionist who believed in settling the land, but not necessarily to create a Jewish national sovereign state. He wrote a very famous essay, Emet Eretz Yisrael, Truth from the Land of Israel. After he got back, he was like, there are people there.
Yeah.
And they're not happy about us coming and taking their land and buying land up from absentee landlords and dispossessing the farmers that have lived there for generations. So this is going to be a problem. And this was a Zionist. There were, up until 48, there were, Jews who considered themselves Zionists that today would be called anti-Zionist, because up until that point, it was still possible to be a Zionist and have these views. The Zionist movement was much more diverse. But since the establishment of the state, that all became moot. And people often will say this, by the way, this is important to bring up, that they say, well, you say you're anti-Zionist, but what kind of Zionism are you really talking about? And there are different kinds of Zionists. And, the bottom line for me is a Zionist is someone who supports Jewish political ethno-state in historic Palestine. Everything else is academic. Everything else, you can call yourself whatever you want, but in terms of the ideology and the kind of Zionism that is embodied by the actual state that's there and by the movement, there are arms of there's the World Zionist Organization, there's the Jewish National Fund, there's a Jewish Agency. These are all Zionist movements with the goal of creating a Jewish ethnic majority in that state and pushing out people who are not. That's what Zionism is. And, everything else is kind of a distraction as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, you can't walk up to a family after their house has been demolished, one of them has been killed, and be like, well, I'm just a cultural Zionist, actually. You know what I mean? So it's not even, this isn't even my
Right.
thing, really. Like,
Yeah. No, that's an important point. You need to define yourself on the basis of what is real. What is having a real impact on the lives of real people. Everything else is abstract. It's an abstraction. And you're welcome to do that, I mean, but don't try to claim that somehow your Zionism has any real effect in the world. That family that's being dispossessed from their home, that they are the most important definition of, as Edward Said put it, Zionism from the point of view of its victims. That's the way you understand what is Zionism, what isn't it.
They'd be like, I eat meat, but I'm a cultural vegan.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to what you said earlier, Rabbi, about how Zionists collaborate with anti-Semites. So even, going back to Herzl, who wrote in his foundational pamphlet that, quote, the governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. He also would write in his diaries that, quote, the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies. So this was really central to the ideology that he was building. And it's not even necessarily lost today. It continues until today, but it's sort of conveniently forgotten when the Zionists purport to speak or equate themselves as Jewish people.
Right. Herzl was currying favor with some really horrible anti-Semites. There's a Russian foreign minister, Plev, who was one of the architects of the Kishinev pogrom, which was the worst pogrom of its day. And there were even Jews in the Zionist movement for whom that was a step too far, saying, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But that was a tacit admission of how deeply embedded the dependence on anti-Semitism was in the Zion and continues to be in the Zionist movement. Zionists need anti-Semites in order to exist, is the bottom line there.
The Zionist movement worked with Nazi Germany. Not a lot of people know this, and some people really don't like to talk about it, but there was actually a commemorative coin issued to encourage immigration. The coin was struck in 1934 to memorialize the journey of Baron von Mittelstein, a Nazi party member, to Palestine. The trip resulted in a pro-Zionist report encouraging Jewish immigration, published in the nationalist newspaper Der Angriff.
You thinking of the transfer agreement?
Yeah, so it's the Havara
agreement. Yeah.
So Havara agreement as well. But I'm talking about the actual, there was a coin minted that has both the Star of David and the Nazi symbol on it.
Yeah, that I can't comment on it because I'm not as aware of that. I mean, the Havara agreement is a point of history. And, it's also important to keep in mind that, for those, historically speaking, the United States has curried favor with Nazis when it was in our best interest, to bring scientists to this country to fight in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so
Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, Paperclip. That kind of hypocrisy runs so deep in the Western world. It's really important to lift these things up, and especially when the weapon of anti-Semite is wielded against people of conscience who are standing for at its core, the dignity of all people and human rights.
You have a follow-up, Michael?
I do. It's about existence of Nazis in Ukraine right now and how they are tokenizing Vladimir Zelensky for being Jewish. And they're like, how could he possibly have Nazis working for him when he's a Jew? And it's like, it's the most disgusting display of tokenism that I've ever seen, because we're watching people who are literal Nazis fight other literal Nazis, and somehow we're like on one of the Nazis' side. And I'm just a little confused. I'd love for the rabbi to weigh in on it.
On what's going on in Ukraine right now?
The proliferation of Nazis and how they are tokenizing a Jewish man who leads the country as like it's impossible for him to have Nazis because he's a Jew. And it's like, actually, they're the ones that are, doing Nazi stuff. So I don't know.
Right. That's also important. Israel's behavior, the government of Israel's behavior during this war right now is really, it's fascinating. The dance that they're this tightrope that they're trying to watch. they've been helping fund the Azov militias for a very long time. I mean, human rights organizations have been complaining about this for a very, very long time. And this goes back to what you were saying about Israel needing anti-Semites. And so they're now, this is, I think, shining a light on the hypocrisy, because on the one hand, they want to welcome these Ukrainian refugees to their country because that gives them a better demographic advantage in trying to create a Jewish majority. They don't want to piss off the Russians because they have a close relationship with Russia, and they're Russian Jewish oligarchs who they don't want to anger either. The road that they're trying to hew to is it's almost impossible to understand what their position is on this war. They seem to be supporting the Ukraine, but they're very, very loath to criticize the Russian government, who they have a very important relationship with. They're so enmeshed in the geopolitics that it's very, very hard for them to maintain any kind of coherent higher ground. I think it's just one more aspect of the fallacy of Zionism that we can see when it's being bandied about in the geopolitical world in this way.
Can you tell us about your own personal path? How you grew up, and then how you ended up in this ideological space that you inhabit today?
Sure. So I grew up in I would call it a fairly Zionist home. I have family in Israel. I visited Israel from a young age. I was always socialized to understand that support for the state of Israel was part of what it meant to be Jewish. My family that I grew up in was on the progressive side politically. So, we've talked about the misnomer of liberal Zionist and progressive Zionist, but that's how I identified, and I spent time when I was in college. I took time off and lived there for about 2 years. I lived on a kibbutz. I was very enamored of labor Zionism, and thought briefly about picking tomatoes for the rest of my life in the Negev. But I always entertained doubts and, issues. There were little voices in the back of my head that were just like really asking these questions: that how can I be a liberal in so many ways and so illiberal when it comes to the state of Israel, and how can I be an anti-war activist in so many ways, but just completely embracing of the militarism that's at the heart of what it means to be Israeli. And, you live in Israel, you can't walk 2 steps without coming face to face with that militarism. And I never really unpacked that, or I avoided unpacking it. But when I became a rabbi, my own personal struggles became very public, and they couldn't just be mine anymore. And little by little, my progressive Zionism began to erode. And to make a long story short, I finally broke with Zionism at the end of 2008 during Operation Cast Lead, in Israel's onslaught on Gaza. And it was just one of those I can't do this anymore moments. I'd been writing a blog. I wrote very openly that these were war crimes. I'm tired of making apologies for Israel. This is just unacceptable and inexcusable, and it can't be defended in any way. And I was part of a congregation in Evanston at the time. I'd been there for many years, and it caused a lot of upheaval, but we managed to make it work. To their credit, we really worked hard. The leadership of the congregation stood by me and understand that this was a conscience thing for me. But there were also many members of my congregation who were just so angry at me and never really made their peace with it. And I became more involved in the movement. I got more involved with Jewish Voice for Peace. I think you mentioned the Rabbinical Council that I helped found, and I became more visible and more vocal. And little by little, it became impossible for me to stay. And that's when I left the congregation. I started working for the American Friends Service Committee, worked with the Quakers. I was a Quaker rabbi, and then I founded Tzedek Chicago shortly after that as well. I mean, I didn't think I'd be able to work as a congregational rabbi anymore, to be honest. I didn't think there was one that would take me. And when we started Tzedek, it was really me and some friends who wanted a place to be, a spiritual community to be, because there wasn't any other place for us. And it just grew much more quickly than we ever expected. And eventually I took over doing it full time 2 years ago. And that's how we come to present day.
Yeah, people were flocking to the margins.
Yeah, the millennials were flocking.
And I got to say, as somebody who's in the margins, it's getting kind of tight in here. We might want to think about expanding.
Yeah. It was it was not something I planned in any way. It was really, a lot of this was very, very unexpected, but this is really my path. And, I feel very blessed to be able to be part of a congregation where I can really be truly my full self and not have to do this torturous dance, moral dance anymore. And, and it's for people who want to be that kind of Jew. And for those who don't dig what we're doing, that's totally fine. There's lots of other congregations for them, but this is for those who hold to the core values that we've articulated very clearly.
Yeah, mazel tov on everything that y'all are doing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We so appreciate you and your perspective.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lara. I really appreciate you reaching out. And thank you for all you do as well.
And Mabruk, and God bless you.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Folks, that has been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Go ahead and check out our website, www.palestinepod.com. We will upload our full sources expeditiously, as T.I. says. Follow us on Instagram at @thepalestinepod. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. And check us out on Patreon, because we are doing some dope stuff behind that paywall. www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank y'all so much for listening. Have a great day. And then what are you recording on? And I mean that with absolutely no disrespect, because it does look like it's a potato right now.
Let's just do my computer.
Okay. Yeah, we're rocking with that. We love that. You a big gamer? That looks like a gamer setup. Rabbi, I'm so sorry. Can you just put your mic a little bit closer to your mouth again?
Sure. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Just moved it slightly when you adjusted.
When I was gestating wildly.
Yeah. When you speaking like an Italian, yeah.
I'm just going to do a really quick introduction. Growing up in a Zionist household, and what was your path like, and some of the response. The usual suspects. Nothing too out there. I don't know what Michael has prepared, but I imagine it's somewhere along the same lines.
I actually thought we were speaking to Elon Musk today. My bad. I've got all the wrong questions.